Hello, I'm Esther Gidui-Ewart. It's Friday, November 11th. This is Africa 54.
President Biden is in Egypt for the COP27 UN Climate Conference, where he spoke of a U.S. climate assistance initiative for Africa and met with Egyptian President al-Sisi. VOA's Anita Powell is there with a report. Today's entertainment segment spotlights Nigerian Afrobeat star Yemi Alade, who chatted with VOA's Heather Maxwell from her Paris events. All this and much more on today's Africa 54.
U.S. President Joe Biden arrived at United Nations climate talks in Egypt on Friday, armed with major domestic achievements against global warming, but under pressure to do more for countries reeling from natural disasters. The U.S. and other wealthier nations are being called on to provide assistance and funding for developing nations to adapt and mitigate the effects of climate change. VOA's Anita Powell reports.
President Joe Biden heads to this landmark United Nations Climate Summit with much to discuss, White House officials say.
He'll speak to his personal commitment to addressing the climate crisis. He'll highlight some of the progress the United States has made, both here at home and in rallying action on climate around the world. And he'll underscore the need to go further, faster, to help the most vulnerable communities build their resilience without losing sight of the need for the world and particularly for the major economies to cut emissions drastically in this decisive decade.
But in a year when floods, heat waves, and extreme weather have ravaged the planet, environmental campaigners want to see something else. In 2015, 196 parties signed the Paris Agreement, a legally binding treaty that, among other things, committed wealthy nations to provide $100 billion a year to help developing nations deal with loss and damage from climate change. Tracking of contributions by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development shows that countries have fallen short of this goal.
There will be significant attention on loss and damage in particular, which has been on the table for a long time.
Some delegates, such as Pakistan's foreign minister, are proposing creative workarounds. Deadly floods devastated his nation earlier this year.
We can envision a scenario where developed countries, the debt that we owe developed countries, instead of transferring that into the bank accounts of richer countries, we could spend that directly on greener reconstruction, rehabilitation, on our energy transition, on adaptation, on mitigation, on our loss and damage. And the developed countries, without having to transfer hard cash, will be able to say that they're meeting their commitments on that front.
U.S. officials are instead focusing on touting the economic effects of the recently passed Inflation Reduction Act, which invests about $375 billion over 10 years to fight climate change.
The act itself made me realize that it boils down to the economy. It boils down to how you look at what's available to us today that can address climate change, but can also deliver tremendous economic benefits. That is true in the developing world as much as it's true in the developed world.
It's not clear how this message will land. On Wednesday, U.S. climate envoy John Kerry was heckled at the conference as he spoke to delegates about a plan to finance clean energy transition in poor countries through private funding, not public. The president arrives in the Egyptian resort town of Sharm el-Sheikh on Friday. From there, he heads to a pair of international summits in East Asia. Anita Powell, VOA News, the White House.
A short time ago, President Biden spoke about climate change and damage it is doing to Africa.
Here in Africa, home to many nations considered most vulnerable to climate change, food insecurity. Hunger follows 4 years of intense drought in the Horn of Africa. Meanwhile, the Niger River in West Africa, swollen because of more intense rainfall, is wreaking havoc on fishing and farming communities. In Nigeria, flooding has recently killed 600 people. 1.3 million more are displaced Seasonal livestock migration routes have been used for hundreds of years, are being altered, increasing the risk of conflict between herders and local farming communities. The climate crisis is about human security, economic security, environmental security, national security, and the very life of the planet.
And joining me from Sharm el-Sheikh with a look at the climate divide is Gareth Walsh, head of the energy team at the Tony Blair Institute for Change. Gareth, welcome to Africa 54.
Thank you, Esther.
Now, there's so much talk about climate change, so much talk about funding. And the question is, will these pledges really be met?
I mean, that's definitely the right question. We work with 18 governments across Africa, and when we meet government officials, it's invariably the first question they have when we talk to them about climate: where is the money that we were promised? We often see lots of big pledges, but obviously it's projects that we want to see. The money that's flowing at the moment is simply not enough. So Africa's climate investment needs are around $300 billion a year. At the moment, around 10% of that is actually flowing. And when you try and look at the reasons, we hear two different perspectives. When you speak to people in the West, countries in the West, they'll say, look, the money's there, but there just aren't the projects in Africa to invest into. But then when we speak to African government officials that we work with, we hear from them that you know, we do have the projects, but you're simply not providing the money. And I think a lot of the work that's required is really around bridging that gap. And whilst it's important what happens in Sharm el-Sheikh and what happens through the UN process, because that sets the framework for this finance, I think it's also as important what happens in the African countries themselves. I think the onus is on the African government not to give the West any excuses not to get this money flowing. So, you know, if the African governments can help by putting in place plans, addressing prerequisites for investment, once they do that, they really should be giving the West no excuse.
But Gareth, are there any role models when it comes to energy transition, whether you look at the African continent, the West, or even Asia, then that other countries can look up to? Because what we're seeing globally is really a damaged continent, a damaged world from the effects of climate change.
Yeah, we're seeing good examples. I mean, we're seeing a couple of good examples on the continent itself. So Egypt have been very clear that they want this COP to be an implementation COP, and they're setting an example with their own energy transition initiative. So they have a plan to deliver around 10 gigawatts of solar, investment in irrigation, investment in water desalination, and they've done a good job of packaging this, and they've secured commitments of financing from, you know, a number of high-profile Western investors. South Africa have also last year, they got an $8.5 billion pledge of support from the EU, Germany, the UK, the US. So I think there are examples of parts of this that are being done well. And then if you look beyond Africa, Indonesia have got a very robust plan for securing finance to accelerate the decommissioning of their coal plant, but also, and I think this is the critical thing for developing countries, establishing a domestic battery manufacturing capability. And I think for African countries, it's not enough for them to focus on mitigation, because frankly, African countries haven't really contributed to this crisis. For the African countries, it really should be about how can we use this money to drive other national objectives, be it job creation, industrialization, things like that.
Very briefly, how practical is it for governments to deliver energy transition reforms?
Well, I think if you're looking at Africa, the phrase energy transition needs a little bit of unpacking. So, you know, we know the numbers. In Africa, 600 million people don't have access to electricity. A lot of the population, the majority of the population, uses firewood for cooking. So, whereas in a lot of the countries that I've just spoken about, the transition is moving away from coal, for example, to other forms of energy. In these African countries, it's much more fundamental. It's about establishing a functioning energy sector in different areas.
Gareth, thank you very much. Gareth Walsh is head of the energy team at the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change. As peace negotiations continue in Kenya between the Ethiopian government and representatives of the Tigray People's Liberation Front, Ethiopia's National Security Advisor says its forces now control 70% of the war-stricken northern Tigray region, and that aid is being sent in. But those claims were swiftly denied by Tigrayan rebels. The restoration of desperately needed humanitarian assistance to the region is one of the key planks of a peace deal agreement between the two sides. The Tigray region is in the grip of a severe humanitarian crisis due to lack of food and medicine, and there is limited access to basic services, including electricity, banking, and communications. Still to come, Heather Maxwell speaks to Nigerian hitmaker Yemi Alade. We'll be back. In other news, Burkina Faso's new legislative assembly opened on Friday with a call for self-sacrifice by the 71 members appointed by the junta that seized power a month ago. Angolan President João Lourenço visited Rwanda on Friday as part of diplomatic efforts to resolve a dispute between Kigali and Kinshasa over the resurgent fighting in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. And a Kenyan court has allowed a request by public prosecutors to withdraw a $60 million corruption case against Deputy President Rigathi Gachagua, citing insufficient evidence. The balance of power in the U.S. Congress for the next 2 years is still unknown after this week's midterm elections, but with ballot counting ongoing in many close races. Washington Post columnist and reporter Dan Balls tells VOA's Carol Van Dam things did not go the way the Republicans had hoped.
Well, it looks like the Republicans are still on track to win the majority, but it's taking much longer than they ever thought it would. Kevin McCarthy, the person who would be Speaker if the Republicans control the House, had plans to come out relatively early on Tuesday night to claim victory. And to the degree he had anything to say that night, it was, when you wake up tomorrow, which is to say when you wake up Wednesday, we will be in the majority. And that passed without coming to truth. If they win the majority, it will be a narrow majority. It will be a quite narrow majority. And that will have implications for Kevin McCarthy and the entire Republican conference as to how they try to govern. Nancy Pelosi learned that having a very slim majority in the House over the last 2 years makes the Speaker's job very difficult, and Kevin McCarthy is going to find the same thing. This will be a divided Republican conference in the House, and so he's going to have to try to maneuver through that. The Senate is still quite up for grabs. There are 2 races out, one in Nevada and another in Arizona. Depending on how those go, the runoff election in Georgia will be, could well be again, as it was in 2020 or early 2021 when they had the 2 runoffs. It could be the deciding vote as to who controls the Senate.
Which means that we'd have to wait a whole lot longer to find out.
I think, again, depending on how, if Nevada falls to the Republicans, which is quite possible, and Arizona holds for the Democrats, which is certainly possible, then we have to wait until December 6th for the Georgia runoff to know which party controls it. At best, at that point, the Democrats would have 50 seats, as they do now, and Vice President Harris would be the tie-breaking vote, or it could be 51-49 Senate with Republicans in control. Either way, as we know, because so much that has to be done in the Senate is with 60 votes, only certain kind of legislation can get through under other rules, the so-called reconciliation rules that allow some big things, budgetary related things, to go through on a majority vote. But to your question about how it affects President Biden, it was interesting yesterday when he did his press conference, and he was able to crow a little bit. He has the lowest number of losses of a newly elected president dating back decades.
To JFK.
Yeah, and and that's no small thing for a president whose approval rating was, depending on how you look at it, 41, 42% going into the election. And it I think reinforces one of the messages that he has carried forth since the day he was a candidate for president in 2020, and that is that he would like to try to find ways to work with the other party whenever possible.
VOA's Carol Van Dam speaking with Washington Post columnist and reporter Dan Balls. The Mercy ship docked at Senegal's port of Dakar for 8 months until the end of October. During that time, doctors operated and treated thousands of patients who could not afford surgery. They also trained several local doctors and health personnel. Khalil Gay reports from Dakar.
As the current Mercy ship's humanitarian mission goes on at the port of Dakar, it is business as usual for the doctors, the administration, and other personnel and patients.
I am satisfied. I wanted my children to get treatment, and the Mercy ship's doctors treated them. I thank God.
Dr. Serine Diop, an advisor to Senegalese President Macky Sall, welcomed the Mercy ship's mission.
It's a great day for us, for Senegal, for the government of Senegal, and for the people of Senegal. We have been waiting this day for the last one year, I would say, and today all our people are happy to have Mercy back here.
According to Dr. Diop, in addition to the treatment, thousands of young Senegalese surgeons, medical personnel, and nutritional agriculture specialists have been trained by the experts on board the ship. The humanitarian ship's medical crew conducts necessary patient surgery and ongoing medical training for local doctors. Indeed, training local doctors and health personnel is another critical activity going on the ship. Anne Grace, a nurse at Bardimeus Hospital in Thiès, 70 kilometers from Dakar, was sent on board the vessel for nursing training to learn the different steps to save a patient who collapses.
As you know, in our culture, when a person collapses, everyone comes running. Everyone is a doctor and talks. It caused me to hold back and to avoid intervening. Still today, the training I received has strengthened my confidence to take the lead and to introduce myself as a nurse who knows how to react by inviting people to avoid specific movements that can worsen the patient's situation.
Time was also taken to celebrate a new ship, the Global Mercy, the world's largest purpose-built hospital ship, but considered by the Mercy ship's officials as just one piece of a larger movement towards safer surgery across the African continent. Indeed, the President of Senegal, Mr. Macky Sall, visited the ship and proceeded to its inauguration in a ceremony commemorating 30 years of Mercy ship service in Africa. The Global Mercy also hosted an international symposium attended by ministers of health and health officials from different African countries. The delegates focused on the challenges facing African nations.
Having ministers of health across the region come together, it is like almost forming a brotherhood, sisterhood sort of like healthcare network, you know, whereby we exchange contact and we have got sideline meetings, like on things like, you know, what is going on in Kenya or what is going on, let's say, like in Chad, and how can that be able to, is going to be beneficial for people of South Sudan. So it's actually very, very, very helpful.
The delegates adopted the Dakar Declaration. The document a commitment to critical improvement in surgical, obstetric, and anesthetic systems across the continent by 2030 were based on input from 29 African nations. Khalil Gay for VOA News, Dakar, Senegal.
Now we turn to Heather Maxwell for this week's entertainment report. Heather, I have the feeling that you've got some powerful female energy coming our way, right?
Hello, Esther. Hi, everyone. Well, yes, that is true. Yemi Alade, the Johnny hitmaker from Nigeria, spoke with me a few days ago in between two huge concerts, one at the Olympia in Paris and the other just yesterday at Intellis in Montreal. It was a delight to get to know her. Here are the highlights of that virtual conversation. Yemi Alade, hello.
Hello.
Your music continues to evolve and change, but one thing that is the same is your incredible energy. Where's this energy coming from?
For me to keep that fire blazing, I must go through rigorous hours of rehearsals, band and music individually, and then as a combination. And I do enjoy that process because I then get to present my art on stage.
I think 2014, is safe to say, was the big game changer for you with Johnny.
Yes, 2014 was the game-changing year in my life. But just before the collaboration on the body of work, Lion King with Beyonce, one of the most fundamental years in my life happened when I released my album, Mama Africa, because I had taken up a mantle that was heavier and bigger than any other mantle I could have considered at that point in time. And that really was a game changer because the entire world accepted me for who I had announced myself to be. Fast forward down the list, then I did a collaboration with Angelique Kidjo, who Mama Africa way before me. That was another game changer. And then the one with Beyonce, who I love and adore.
Prioritize collaborating with women?
100% I do.
Cue the music. Let's go. Let's get it.
Yemi, you show yourself as multiple Yemis. So there's the rural Yemi, there's the urban, all these.
I'm Superwoman.
Is there a side or a facet of you that you have not showed yet?
I'm also enjoying this journey called life, you know, and I also notice that as I grow older, there's some things about me that change and there are new facets that get unlocked. But there's one facet I'm not sharing with the world, and that is just the Yemi that wants to stay under her duvet and just not do anything, not go anywhere, not speak to anyone, just be.
Yo, when I get home, first of all, there's a bathtub I'm gonna soak in.
I keep that facet to myself, but the other sides to me definitely would be fashion. I think that facet is yet to be truly her next.
Yes, that's the mindset right now.
Do you select some of the fashion in your music videos?
I have taken control over that for a long time. I'm in charge of my creative, my fashion creations, etc. I sketch, I put designs together, and I work with designers and stylists that understand that my branding is very fearless and anything is possible when it comes to the clothes that I wear.
So are you going to have your own line?
I can't tell you yet, but...
In one of the music videos, at the end of it, you quoted something like, "Children are a gift of God, whether it's female or male." So is that still a common problem that you see in Nigeria?
Some people can go ahead and have as many as 7 kids, and they will not rest until they have their male child because of the many things that culture and tradition has tied to the superiority of the male child over the female child. So yes, it's still prevalent culture in the entire Africa. These days, a lot of things are changing. People are understanding that a child is a child.
When you decided to name yourself Mama Africa?
My very point in time when I named myself Mama Africa and I named my album Mama Africa is to impact as positively as possible on the lives of kids at home when they turn up on their TV. I want them to watch things that would inspire them. I had just taken up the role on the inside. And on the outside as well, I was going all out to enjoy all the cultures. Today I could be dressed in a Kenyan attire. Tomorrow it could be Ethiopian, it could be Ugandan. I just travel the world as I move from concert to concert. I pick a piece of culture with me because I wholeheartedly love it.
Thank you very much for joining me on Music Time in Africa on the Voice of America, Yemi Alade.
Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Now, as I mentioned, her concert in Montreal, Canada happened yesterday. Too soon to get you a glimpse of that performance today, but I'll try to share some next week right here on Africa 54 and also on my Music Time in Africa YouTube channel and social media. Esther?
Fantastic, Heather. Thank you. Be sure to join Heather Maxwell's Entertainment Report every Friday right here on Africa 54. And that's our show for today. Be sure to watch Africa 54 on our website at voaafrica.com. From all of us here in Washington, have a great weekend. Come on.
Today, we pay homage to the unrelenting bravery and dedication that distinguish all those who have earned the title of American veteran. It's an honor that not only a small percentage of Americans can claim, and one that marks those who are able to claim it as brothers and sisters. It's a badge of courage that unites across all ages, regardless of background, because to be a veteran is to have endured and survived challenges most Americans will never know. You've come through the trials and testing, braved dangers and deprivations, faced down tragic realities of war and death. To all our veterans, past and present, we thank you, we honor you, and we remember always what you've done for us.